Hi there. Welcome to the revision lecture where I'm going to whiz through the key sort of left realist and right realist ideas about the causes for crime and the solutions that are often linked to their ideas of causes. Left realism and right realism are an incredibly useful couple of theories to be aware of. There's lots of policies that have been suggested by these theories, and a number of them have been introduced. So, if you get any questions about crime prevention policy or crime prevention strategies, a lot of left and right realism should be used there. So anything that says crime prevention policies, left and right realism are kind of your go-to for your ideas because they are, if you like, both of them argue that the older theories that we've looked at so far, like functionalism, Marxism, symbolic interactionism, they don't offer any realistic solutions. So hence the realism. They want some realistic ideas. So I'm going to jump in with left realism. On this slide, you can see the bones of their theory. Left realists talk very much about the square of crime, where one part is out of balance, crime becomes more likely. So the square of crime is victims, offenders, informal social control, and formal social control. And they have a number of solutions kind of linked to those four areas. So, as I've said in every other one of my revision lectures, it might be worth pausing at this point, splurging as much as you can remember about each of these different areas, and then listening to at least the left realist part of the lecture to kind of fill in any gaps, and then perhaps do that for right realism on the next slide as well if I forget to mention it. Anyway, so yeah, like I said, square of crime is the key idea. Left realism is very much Lee and Young's theory. I should have put that on the slide. I don't know why I didn't, but yeah, Jock Young pops up again, but it's Lee and Young. Um, LEE, Young and Young. So when it comes to victims, left realists, much more left wing, much more Marxist ideas. Okay, a bit more symbolic interactionism in here as well. So they say, yep, victims, they said the fear of crime is justified and it should be taken seriously. So I know the other theories we've looked at before, things like the media over-report and create fear. But actually, left realists say, yeah, people are scared and their fears should be taken seriously. And they also highlight that it's people who are of low income are much more likely to be victimized. They're more likely to live in high crime areas. They're more likely to live in properties that are much more easy to commit crime against. They themselves are much more likely to be victims of crime because they perhaps they are less protected. So for them, it is really important that victims are made to feel safe and victimization chances are reduced. Now, they say a lot about offenders. Okay, so they say one of the reasons why people offend is when there is a lot of relative deprivation. So that's poverty, but it's made worse by relative deprivation, which means that things like the media, for example, can make people feel more deprived. And then you start to see things become very important within deprived communities, such things, what's known as conspicuous consumption. So people might spend money on branded goods, sportswear, nice cars, flashy TV screens, whatever, because that's conspicuous consumption. They're showing that they can afford it because perhaps being in poverty might be something they might be ashamed of. So brands become very important. But what they do is they might spend what limited resources they have on those goods, conspicuous consumption, at the expense of paying heating or food bills. Okay. And that's when crime becomes more likely. Um, Also within offenders, subcultures are much more common, like criminal and deviant. If you've got an area or a place where criminal, deviant, gang subcultures are prevalent, young people, but not just young people, but working class people are more likely to join them. And actually, they're more likely to normalize the deviant ways to meet these material needs, whether that's through benefit cheating or through crime, like, drug dealing, theft, burglary, robbery, what have you. But they also point out that offenders are more likely to choose to act criminally if they feel marginalized. So if people are marginalized, they're kind of pushed to the outskirts of society. They feel unwanted. They're not listened to by politicians. Like politicians don't care about their vote. And that kind of makes crime much more likely as well. There's also if they also talk about informal social control and formal social control. So informal social control is things like families and neighborhoods, particularly they focus on. So they point out that the capitalist workplace has basically putting more demands on us in terms of our hours working. We work much longer days now, means that we're away from our houses for longer, which is much more opportunity for burglary. We also are more likely to own cars to travel to work, another opportunity for car theft or car robbery, burglary. Um, but they also point out that young people are more likely to be left unattended for longer periods of time. Like the school day finishes at around about 3, but most parents don't finish work until 5 and then they have to travel, so maybe get home at 6. So there is this kind of period of time for a lot of teenagers on secondary where they're kind of unsupervised. And left realists point out there's quite a lot of opportunities for crime and deviance in that context. Um, there's also, they talk about the growth of individualism. So people, as in neighborhoods, there's a lot less of a sense of collective responsibility by the community. People don't know their neighbors, they don't look out for their neighbors. And that kind of makes crime a bit easier then, because you won't be aware of who might be living in your neighborhood. You might not care if someone's going up to someone's door or window. You might just think that's just someone dropping off a package or whatever and not do anything about it. And then formal social control. Left realists are incredibly critical of a lot of the policing strategies that we've discussed before, like conflict style of policing. And they say what's that's done is created a them versus us relationship between the police and working class communities, or the police and ethnic minority communities, where those communities, the working class and ethnic minorities, they look at the police and they say, look, they are not being held accountable. The police can treat us in any way they like. They can be violent to us. They can be racist. They can be prejudiced to us, and nobody does anything. The police themselves can do crime, and nobody is doing anything about that. So they don't trust the police. Okay. And that makes crime more likely because it's labeling theory. If conflict style of policing is happening, you might like to be labeled as criminal, self-fulfilling prophecy. But also, you might just not respect the law because you don't respect the police. So crime becomes much more likely. Um, Left realist solutions, then, in regards to victims, they point to things like street lighting and CCTV, helps make people feel safer, nicer neighborhoods, which kind of links a bit to that, broken windows series that I'll talk about in a second, and community policing. Police officers, like having more police officers in the community there, seem to actually help people out rather than being there to police and kind of hold people to account. Um, when it comes to offenders, they talk about, the main thing would be to get rid of inequality. Okay. Um, and that might be through things like such as increasing benefits, or improving education and work opportunities for people who are perhaps suffering levels of poverty. Um, they could also reduce marginalization through things like community projects. And left realists are very much about treating the causes of crime, like particularly drug and alcohol problems, with rehabilitation and not prison. So allow people to reintegrate into society, treat the issues instead of sending to prison quite often, where people's addictions can be made much worse. And we looked at, I think it was Akala, and him talking about how actually it's very important to intervene in family lives earlier if there's things like violence, or abuse going on, because quite often children raised in those environments become criminal themselves. So it's about, again, the role of social services, trying to help young people from a very young age. Um, there's also the solutions to informal social control. Interestingly, they're very keen to kind of maybe extend the school day, so that you don't have that kind of unsupervised time. But also more wraparound care in schools, like more before school clubs and after school clubs, or even community centres. Those would all kind of help people feel like they were more connected, but also make sure that young people aren't left to a kind of to their own means to act delinquently. Then there's solutions for formal social control. So they talk about, there's the example introduced by New Labour where they elected police commissioners. So now the heads of the various police areas in the UK are now elected. And this is supposed to make police more accountable to their communities. It is worth evaluating that, firstly, the areas of these police are absolutely enormous. Like the south, east, and west, I think we're part of. It's absolutely ginormous, and I've never even seen our police commissioner area. But also, it is an election that has an incredibly low voter turnout. And those that do vote tend to be those groups like white, middle class, more likely to be older, not those groups that feel that the police are not accountable, that have the them versus us relationship. Um, Another solution, police body cameras, which obviously, in theory, should reduce conflict style of policing, unfair stop and search. And as I've mentioned before, community police officers there to kind of build relationships within the community rather than just demonize and criminalize those groups. However, the biggest problem with left realism is a lot of their solutions are incredibly complicated. Like improving education is a very complicated solution. They're also very expensive, although they should pay off in the long term because people won't offend and most people should be able to work, which would really help. We would earn money through tax. And this other idea of there's a resentment that exists in society, kind of known as this kind of deprivation downwards. Like people are quite hostile to this deprivation downwards. And they don't want to help people out who are perhaps deprived because they sort of feel like, they're work shy. And that's very much driven by a narrative, maybe in the media, by a capitalist state that want people to work, okay, and actually want us to feel like the working class aren't to be trusted and actually are more criminal and deviant. So a lot of left realist solutions are not ideologically popular. They don't often get introduced. But there are things that have come through recently. For example, there's talking about extending free school meals, for example. That is about a policy aimed at kind of getting rid of relative deprivation, for example. So, right realism has a very different take on the causes and the solutions to crime. I've got the key ideas on this slide here. So, they argue that crime is a rational choice, but then they blame crime on inadequate socialization, such as the underclass. And biological differences. And then their solutions, the main ones that we've looked at in class, broken windows theory, things like zero tolerance and harsher punishments, and things like environmental crime prevention strategies like situational crime prevention. So it might be an idea to pause the lecture at this point and have a knowledge splurge and a bit of paper about everything you can remember about these different ideas, and then using the lecture kind of fill in the gaps as I've discussed before. If not, I'll just go through it with you now. So, right realists believe that crime is a rational choice, and most of the policies, in fact, all of their policies, are based on this rational choice theory. So, they believe that when someone chooses to commit a crime, they weigh up the chance of being caught, the consequences if they are caught, so the type of punishment, and the potential rewards, like how much money will they earn, how much will they benefit from it. And they point out that through control theory, they say that when informal social control is weak and people don't have lots of social bonds and lots of connections. So I've always talked about my example, like I work, I am a teacher, I am a mum, I am a friend, I am a daughter. I have lots of social connections, so I've got quite strong social control. So I've got quite a lot to lose if I commit a crime. But if someone who is unemployed, someone who doesn't have close family, people who've maybe had their kids taken into care or haven't got any kids, they haven't really, or young people, they haven't got a lot of control. So they've got weak social bonds. So crime becomes that there's not so much to lose. So the consequences aren't so harsh about going to jail if you haven't got any of those connections, and the rewards might outweigh that. And they do point out, like, if there is a lack of jobs, then the rational choice to offend also becomes much, much stronger. You've then got Charles Murray's, well, the right realists also blame crime on inadequate socialization, people being socialized into deviant norms and values. Now, this is very much the idea of Charles Murray. He says that crime is caused by inadequate socialization, mainly within lone parent families. The underclass are socialized into deviant norms and values, such as benefits dependency, not valuing work, drug taking, and alcoholism is seen as normal. And he says, as a result, they have weak social bonds, so crime becomes much, much easier. And finally, there are biological differences, okay, within the right realist theory, okay? So they point out things like low IQ makes crime much more likely. Okay, low IQ makes crime much more likely. And there's evidence for that in the sense that in America, you can't be executed if you've got an IQ less than 70. They also argue, in terms of biological differences, some people's brain makeups actually means they've got personality traits that makes crime much more likely, such as being aggressive, impulsive, and risk-taking. And some people have these biological differences, which mean that crime becomes much more likely. Now, you can't make social policy, you can't make, criminal policy for inadequate socialization, really. Well, maybe you could cut benefits to lone parent families, that might be one. And you can't really make policy for biological differences. But what you can do is make policy for rational choice. So some of their key solutions based on rational choice is broken windows theory. Now, this is the idea that if you are in a neighborhood where there are lots of broken windows or lots of graffiti, lots of litter, a rational offender, somebody who's thinking rationally, will look at the area and go, "Oh, crime looks like it's tolerated here. Low-level deviance is tolerated here. Oh, this looks like a good area to maybe do some drug dealing. This looks like a good area to maybe run some sort of criminal operation out of because no one's reporting, no one cares." Um, and that was kind of proved by an experiment by Zimbardo. He parked a car in a deprived area. I think it was the Bronx in America, and he parked a car in a posh area, or poshish area called Palo Alto. And I think he broke a window in both cars. Or no, yeah, left it unlocked or popped the hood or something like that. Now, within hours, the car parked in the deprived area where there was lots of broken windows, lots of deprivation in the area. Nobody seemed to care about the area. That car was vandalized and stripped really quickly. Whereas the one in the middle class neighborhood sort of was left harmed for like a number of days before Zimbardo went and broke a window. And then I think eventually people did actually kind of vandalize it. But it seemed to prove that a car in a deprived area, or people were more likely to commit crime in deprived areas. Now, what that proves then is if you clean up a neighborhood, crime drops. And they did this to the New York subway system. They cleaned off all the graffiti. They made it look like people cared about the subway, and people stopped committing low-level crime like fare dodging, but also gangs stopped using the subways. Sexual violence dropped on the subways. So all types of crime dropped on the subways, which seems to prove that when people think that people care about an area or subways, that crime becomes much less likely because it's not seen as tolerated. However, the evaluation for broken windows is that what this does is just displaces it to another area. Okay, people will just commit crime around the corner, they'll commit crime in another space, or they'll change the type of crime that they wanted to commit. The second strategy from right realism in terms of their solutions is zero tolerance. Zero tolerance policing. This is very much the idea that if you increase the consequences for crime, with much harsher punishments, like longer jail time, really, really incredibly large fines, then crime becomes less likely. This was used in New York. They used a zero tolerance, three strikes and you're out approach. You ended up out as in jail. And they did this for very low level street crime. So loitering, drinking in the street, kicking a ball against the wall in the wrong place. You could get a strike for that sort of stuff. The idea being that if you don't tolerate low level street crime, then much serious crime will stop. And it did seem to work in America. Like crime dropped like an astonishing, I think something crazy, like 40, 50%. The big evaluation for that, however, was that there were other explanations for crime dropping in New York. There was the argument that actually crime dropped across the whole country in America. Crack cocaine stopped being used, which had made people much more violent. And that 20 years prior to this, the Roe versus Wade had been heard and passed, which made abortion legal. So a lot of people who might have had unwanted pregnancies 20 years ago didn't have them. So there were actually less young people growing up in troubled homes where they would not have been wanted, where there was lots of poverty, and maybe crime would have become more likely. So there are lots of reasons and evaluations to say actually zero tolerance in New York, has not been as effective as it looked. And it's also created things like mass incarceration. It's led to huge swathes of the poor and minority population in New York being put into jail. And it also incentivized arrests because like police officers were like incentivized by like league table type things to give out as many of these strikes as possible. And of course, all of this ignores white collar and corporate crime. Finally, one of this other strategy, which is like an environmental crime prevention strategy, is in situational crime prevention, where you try to design crime out of a situation or an area. And there's sort of three strategies to this, where you use things like target hardening. You make it harder to rob something, so putting alarms on all cars. That's an example of target hardening. Capable guardians, they could be like guard dogs, or what's been more common and much more popular has been the use of CCTV as a capable guardian. And actually reducing the motivation of offenders by using harsh punishments that we talked about before, and reducing the rewards, like making it much more difficult to sell products illegally, making it much more difficult to kind of maybe deal drugs by cutting some of the things that are used to make some of these drugs from the production line. Just before I finish, I want to talk to you a little bit about CCTV, because CCTV is a crime prevention strategy that is liked by both left and right realism. They're both fans of it. Left realism's mainly because it helps victims feel safer. That's their main reason for liking it. And it is probably much more of a right realist strategy that's been adopted, largely because it deters offenders, they believe, and it makes it easier to catch them. Because if you're a rational criminal, you'll look at a CCTV camera and go, "Oh, I'm not going to commit my crime here. That CCTV camera is pointing at me." Or, but if you do commit the crime, you'll be able to be caught, according to right realists. Now, this was such a powerful idea that in the 90s, 4/5 of the Home Office security budget in the UK was spent on CCTV. Okay, so it was an incredibly ideologically popular approach. Um, the public seemed to be on board with it, and the government certainly was on board with it. However, research does suggest that actually CCTV as a strategy is not that effective in preventing crime. There was a quote from an article that we looked at called Surveillance Society, and it said, ultimately, a camera is not going to climb down off a lamppost and prevent a crime occurring. All a camera can do is record it. Okay, it's not actually going to stop a crime happening. And it doesn't deter offenders that are not rational. And we know lots of street crime takes place because of drugs and alcohol. Apologies for misspelling alcohol. So it doesn't actually help for the majority of street crime, which takes place under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And there's also, from a Marxist perspective, a lot of evidence really that they seem to be better at protecting property than people. Like there are lots of them in town centres or car parks, but not as many of them perhaps pointed towards protecting people outside of those contexts. That they don't seem to be that effective outside of those sort of areas. So that's just another strategy that I wanted you to think of a bit more critically, because we did spend a lot of time in class kind of thinking about the role of CCTV. Okay. Thanks so much for listening to this lecture on the left and right realist perspective on crime and deviance. I hope it's been useful.